Hi, everybody. So first of all, thank you guys for being here on the last day of AutoCon 2, and I'm excited to talk to you about something that we haven't heard a lot about yet, which is how mid-sized organizations that are a little smaller than enterprise can begin to leverage automation. So first, a little bit about me. I'm Assistant Vice President of IT Infrastructure at a mid-sized credit union in the state of Pennsylvania. I'm really active on LinkedIn. Since this is a short talk and we don't have time for questions, that's a really great place to ask them. So let's talk about some of the constraints that we see as mid-sized organizations when we try to start adopting automation. So these first three constraints sort of all go hand in hand. So we generally don't have dedicated network automation teams, which means the people that are responsible for driving our automation efforts already have day-to-day tasks that they're doing, and they're looking to automation to save time. And even though we might start automating, we have smaller infrastructure, so we may not have a solid place to put our code, whether that be on-prem or in the cloud. And we also have, obviously, increased budget constraints, which means that even small asks for larger companies may be bigger asks for us. And all of these sort of limited resource constraints here sort of come together to mean that we sort of lack a scalable approach, because even when we begin to automate, we usually don't do it in a very formal manner. So how do we supplement that lack of dedicated resources? And I think the thing that we have to remember here is that sometimes initially we don't. Sometimes it takes that one person to be the champion of automation for that organization to sort of put their foot forward and say, we're going to spend this time up front to save this time, over the rest of, operationally over the rest of the time. And what if our budget is still then zero? And I think this is a cool question we ask now, because a lot of our things that we buy, a lot of our new network orchestration platforms and network devices have APIs that are already built into them, especially because as we do network refreshes, we're going to more controller-based networks, which means we're automating more against one central point. And I think that our leadership would actually be really pleased to see us pull that value out of something that we already own. So how do we resolve some of these scalability issues and ensure that our projects are robust enough to scale? And I think that the thing to remember here is that we have to ingrain good development practices into our engineers as they're learning how to program. So as we're doing those first ad hoc scripts, we need to make sure that we're following good development practices, because we're essentially taking network engineers and giving them development capabilities. And then how do we promote widespread understanding of our code? And I think that coding as a network engineer is a little different than coding as a software developer, because we need to write our comments as if they're being read by the perspective of network engineers. And I think that if we do that, it really holds its weight and helps us scale our automation. So let's talk a little bit more about our first big project that has eyes on it from around the organization. And before we do that, I want to look at this pyramid that I made, which basically I think encompasses how network engineers should learn automation. And I think a lot of engineers are thrown into an environment where they start with IAC tools and they sort of don't understand those middle layers and those layers of interaction. And I think when we do that, although we've achieved, that final goal of IAC, we sort of don't know how to troubleshoot those middle layers when things start to break apart. So I really think that, just like automation is a journey for an organization, it's also a journey for the people that are at that organization while the organization is undergoing the journey. And it's important to remember that. So when I started my first projects, I started with read-only projects. And what I mean by that is a lot of our network orchestration platforms will allow us to generate read-only API keys. And I think that that's a great way to start building things that can produce measurable operational value and be able to show our leadership, hey, this is the value in automation, without giving us the ability to break things. And we have to remember that our first project is our first impression. So the first project that we get buy-in to spend time on is going to be our first impression to leadership. And we want to make sure we don't bite off more than we can chew, because it's going to make further automation efforts harder to sell. And to talk about some of the first project tools that I use and that I recommend, the stuff on the left side here is kind of obvious. VS Code is sort of the go-to IDE now, and we want some sort of version control ingrained at the beginning. But what I really want to talk about is the right-hand side here, the part that I'm calling out existing APIs. And the reason I do that is because I think a lot of network engineers gravitate to scraping SSH because they're combining a protocol that they know and then they're programming on top of it, and it sort of just makes sense to them. But I think that it makes for a really abrasive development experience, and a lot of the network devices we have these days have existing APIs in them, and it just makes a lot more sense, and it's a lot easier if we leverage those. And then as we code our first project, we want to make sure our project has a thorough README. And I know everybody says this, but I want to elaborate on it a little more and say that it needs to be thorough from the perspective of someone outside your team. Because we need to be able to take that README and take our code from cloning it to execution just using that README. Because if they need to be asking you questions as they're deploying your code, that means that your code can't survive without you, and that's a really bad development practice. And we also need to make sure that in hand with that, we have the resources to follow that README, like our requirements files, our environment templates, and anything else that we're using to clone that code. And then a little bit about hosting our code. So I think we sort of default to putting our code on-prem as network engineers, probably because most of our network is on-prem. But I think there's a lot of value in putting code in serverless functions now, especially as our organizations that are mid-sized now are growing, and you might be on a different team than your system's counterparts. It's a lot easier for you to not have to manage that bottom half of the stack when you want to start automating. And also, since a lot of our new network controllers are in the cloud, your code actually might be closer and more robust being in something like a Lambda function than running in your on-prem data center. And then a little bit about scaling our first project. So we want to make sure that our first project doesn't turn into technical debt. And one of the ways I think is the easiest to make this not happen is by ingraining those good values at the beginning and making sure that we are treating our network engineers as developers, we're giving them resources, and we're making them start with their best foot forward. And then a little bit about redundancy and longevity. So our code needs to be transportable to make it scalable. We can't be tying our code to the box that it's running on, especially in the days where we're moving, entire platforms between clouds, on-prem to cloud, stuff like that. Our code needs to be very transportable, or it's going to die, the first time we try to transport it. And then the obvious, multiple people should be able to explain what your code does and why. And this might be obvious at a bigger company, but at smaller companies, like I said, we generally have that one person that comes on board that starts these automation efforts. And if that's the only person that can explain why this code is here and why it does what it does, then that code's going to die when that person leaves the company. And with that, thank you for coming to my talk, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the time at AutoCon too.